Hey, John Gilroy here. Here we are in the beginning of 2025. There are so many changes taking place with federal information technology. Some people keep their eye off the ball. Today, we're going to go back to where you should be focusing on is your supply chain. Hit the music, Manny. Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, the podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Our guest today is Jason English. He's the vice president at a company called Babel Street, B-A-B-E-O. Jason, how are you?
I'm doing great, John. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I had that opening because I think if I went down to Washington, D.C. here, January, February 2025, there'd be pandemonium, people running in the streets, screaming, going, my building's closed, my building's open. And what happens is then you leave yourself up to bad guys making attacks. And that's why I want to maybe take and step back and maybe step back from all the adventures in downtown D.C. and talk about supply chain and what you do can help my agencies, ensure that. So I want to talk about supply chain today and some funny little acronym called OSINT. What the heck is OSINT?
That's a great question, John. OSINT, otherwise known as OSINT or Open Source Intelligence. It's one of a number of different intelligence disciplines that have been in existence for quite some time. As a career Navy intelligence officer, it's one that we incorporate into the things that we do to understand what our adversaries are up to. So I think the formal definition of open source intelligence is intelligence that's derived exclusively from public and commercial information. But it's information that's used to answer intelligence priorities, intelligence requirements, and fill intelligence gaps. And open source intelligence can come in a lot of different ways: newspapers, social media, blogs, web posts, forums, public records, academic research, publications, as well as even government reports and filings. Anything that is out there on the internet that's public and commercial. It's considered OSINT.
Yeah, it seems pretty apparent, but it's really actually difficult to pull off. And when you sit back and try, if I was in a classroom and had a whiteboard, I'd say, okay, if we had to use some kind of classified source of information, it would be expensive. And this is a lot less expensive. And so all of a sudden you start talking about, the big push today is efficiency. So how can you be more efficient about the dollar spend you have for any intelligence? And that's one of the main strengths, I think, of open source intelligence, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. By comparison, open source intelligence, when you look at it relative to the other intelligence disciplines, is the lowest cost for all of them. It's most of your sources are either free or relatively inexpensive by comparison. When you're talking open source information, with the kind of costs that are involved are things like subscription fees for databases. And that ranges based on the premium level of those databases, but also some specialized software and tools and data, but also personnel for some analytic training and tradecraft. When you look at some of the other disciplines, John, looking at human intelligence, which is getting information from human sources, that's relatively high cost. You've got a lot of tradecraft training that goes into that, recruitment of sources, maintaining and protecting those sources. So a lot of that tradecraft, and as well, depending on the level of collection, whether you are in an overt collection capacity and what we call a true name, or you are in some kind of a cover status, there's a lot of backstop and infrastructure that's required to keep that cover program in place. But then even the sources themselves, they require some type of hook and payment. So that's usually kind of expensive.
Yeah. And what happens is if you buy a $1,500 snowblower, you're going to use it as much as you can. And the same thing is if you're paying for sources, you may just focus on one source for information where you're blindsided. And so I think what open source information also, it opens up the whole aperture, doesn't it? It goes, no, let's look at a bunch of different things. We may be too siloed, maybe too targeted here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. With the number of different sources that are out there, for instance, our company, we've got over 150,000 different sources. And so one of the advantages you get in addition to cost is that vast and varied number of sources that you can leverage to cross corroborate your information, and you can get a sense of just how accurate the information you're looking at is.
Well, back when you were in high school, you would be taking your algebra and the teacher would say, Jason, show me your work. You go, oh, okay. And you probably did pretty well with that. And I think that's what's going on in a lot of cybersecurity circles. People are saying, oh, really, Jason, show me your work. Well, transparency. And yes, this is where I got this source, and you can confirm anything. And so the transparency, it seems to be bang, bang, cost, efficiency, transparency. Transparency is pretty obvious with this type of research, isn't it?
Yeah, transparency is definitely something that's also an advantage here because the information is out there, it's free and it's accessible. And there's, with the other types of information, other types of intelligence and the sources, you're trying to protect those, the sources and methods. And so it's hard to get some of the details of that information. But with open source, it is completely transparent.
So Babel Street's been doing this for years, all kinds of different organizations, many different sources. So now we know how you generate this information. So the next step is, well, give me for instance, what about, I guess I'm trying to think of one way to apply this would be maybe in the area of risk identification, risk mitigation. Is that a good application?
Oh, absolutely. It's one of a number of different applications. So, when you look at organizations that are trying to identify risks, and usually you're trying to obtain those or identify those risks before they escalate to a point of impacting your mission or your operations. And that applies across a number of different areas. I think, just from a threat intelligence perspective, open source intelligence allows you to monitor hacker forums and social media, observe cyber activities, or if you are a military organization, potential indicators of military activity. So that INW is key. When you look at geopolitical activity, open source intelligence gives you insight into political instability, conflicts as they start to arise, and are able to, in many cases, showcase exactly what a nation state is preparing to do. Even economic changes that may occur as a result of those geopolitical risks. And you mentioned supply chain, John, earlier. Supply chain risks are very vast. They're very complex. And we know from anybody that lived through COVID knows that supply chains are very fragile. So open source information can identify vulnerabilities in those global supply chains and the different environmental and cyber or supplier risks that are associated with those. And the other thing that comes to mind is from just a business standpoint in the private sector world, the risk of reputation. You can use open source information to detect negative press or any social media rants that might be going on about your particular business or line of operations. So you can get ahead of those, John, with open source information.
Here's the challenge I see. There's a guy named Neil Patel. He's a very well-known marketing guy based in Los Angeles. And he says that there are 1 billion blogs out there. So that's one blog for every 7 people. So, okay, Jason, I want you to take 8 hours tomorrow and just review those blogs for what they're saying about my company. Oh, really? Yeah. It's just the challenge, I think, is in the volume. And maybe that's the secret sauce that Babel has. Maybe they can say, okay, here's how we take and attempt to at least take a stab at seeing what's going on. Or what is sentiment? How do you analyze sentiment? You have to have a wide range. How big is enough? Jason, do I have to read all 1 billion blogs? Or is there a certain section? It's just it sounds easy, but I think the application is difficult with just the amount of information out there.
Yeah, John, if I had a nickel for every senior leader, whether they are civilian or military, that has mentioned the problem with big data and analyzing that data, I would have quite a bit of money and probably wouldn't need to be doing a podcast like this. But you're right, John. The big data is a big problem. And so what you really want to find is the needle in that haystack. And so as artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies have really advanced in the technological scale here in this present day, incorporating those is an absolute necessity to be able to take all that information that's out there, pull it back, and then analyze it in a way that actually transcends above the data and gets to information and knowledge that helps solve problems. And so what we here at Babel do is we incorporate a very advanced integrated AI-powered pipeline of analytics that we apply and integrate with that data so that a user is able to take those billions of blog posts and do multilingual smart searches and be able to pull back the information that they're truly looking for, and does it in a very smart way, and it surfaces the kind of risk indicators that they are looking for.
Multilingual Babel, it makes a whole lot of sense. Now, this is just a 25-minute podcast hitting the mountains, and people can go into deeper dive. You guys put together webinars, is that right?
We do put together webinars, and we have one coming up here next month.
I got the press release right here. Thursday, March 20th at 3 p.m. And here's the name of it. Great name. It's called No More, Risk Less. I guess that's addressed risk identification. It's going to be a 60-minute, and it's going to go into depth and tell exactly how your artificial intelligence helps filter the needle in the haystack in 15 different languages. And what I'll do is I'll put a link to this webinar in the show notes, and you can go to failtechpodcast.com, and I think this is episode 216. You can sign right up for it, and I'll let people know on social media. So it's if you're intrigued by what Jason has to say, I mean, he has a very thorough intelligence background, very, very thorough. And he chose to work for Babel. There must be a reason for it. So what you can do is attend this webinar and get more and more ideas of what exactly is going on with them. So supply chain, the most obvious application. What about identity management? Is that too far afield?
No, those are definitely, and these are examples, John, of the harder type problem sets that are out there, the more complex. When we started back in 2009, general use cases like situational awareness and threat indications, things like that were a lot less complex, and so that's where we focused on. But as identity management, think things like anti-money laundering or know your customer for private sector, supply chain risk, understanding the identity of the suppliers in there where there's tons of aliases and intentional efforts by adversaries to obfuscate those identities. You really have to leverage the power of open source information to understand what those true identities are. And it's more than just bringing that data into a warehouse. It's leveraging what we talked about a minute ago and analyzing it in a way that surfaces those identities so you understand truly what you're looking at.
It has waste, fraud, abuse written all over it. I've been thinking, well, I mean, put your eye down to Florida and see what's going on there. I mean, I know there's a lot of bad things going on in Florida with waste, fraud, and abuse, but this would be a way to filter through, 12 different LLCs representing different companies and money transferring here, money transferring there. All of a sudden, things come up. It's maybe even the classified information wouldn't even detect some of the things that are going on with waste, fraud, and abuse.
Yeah, and John, what you're describing there is what we refer to as digital dust. Any kind of transaction, any kind of signature that you have on the internet leaves some level of digital dust. It's the peril that I warn my children about on social media and things like that. And any kind of transaction that takes place or comment that's made, it's out there. But if you are executing some sort of legitimate transaction, you're going to leave a trail. And more often than not, that trail is going to be accessible through the public or commercial domain. And getting access to that and understanding where those transactions are taking place allows you to truly identify whether those transactions are fraudulent or not. Also identifies potential insider threats. So it might be a legitimate transaction, but done in a nefarious way to undermine the operations of a company or a competitor.
Yeah. And there might be specific targeted applications. I think one might be for compliance. I mean, there's a lot of checklists. I think the obvious thing I think is risk management with supply chain. Then I think about identity management. But there's so many. Finance has got to come in there. I mean,
yeah, and you mentioned compliance, quality control of products. One of the areas, and it has a direct application to the supply chain, is when you're looking at the quality control and quality assurance for your parts, trying to identify whether or detect any counterfeit actions that might be going on as part of the adversary, identifying those products being sold online by either criminal organizations or criminal individuals or adversary nations that are doing it in a way to undermine U.S. military capability to wage and win wars.
So do you extend all the way to the dark web?
We do. Deep in dark web, our access extends all the way there. And as a matter of fact, that's where a lot of these criminal and hacktivists and people that are trying to obscure their activities reside. And so having access to that is one of our key differentiators that gives us the ability to see additional layers of that information and analyze it.
I tell you, if I ever had a job where I had to go in the dark web, I'd build a shed in my backyard and I'd get a separate computer no one can touch. And then I'd have I would be so scared to go near that. I mean, I don't know how you get people actually to do it because it's got to be a dangerous place to be.
It is a frightening place to be, John, and one that I don't encourage anybody to try to touch. But the mere fact that it is what it is, it's an imperative that we are able to access that to underscore the importance of identifying criminal activity, because that's where it exists. That's where a lot of it exists, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, let me read between the lines here. Jason has an extensive background in the military, been in the Naval Academy, has worked in a lot of different sensitive organizations, and he's probably telling us about 2% of what he knows in regards to this because it's stuff that you can't really talk about. So you might want to go to that webinar and connect to someone and ask some questions about specific applications. But I'm looking at your background here. I mean, you've worked on Capitol Hill, you've worked in different organizations, Carrier Strike Group, Director of Intelligence. I mean, you must have a hard time just not talking about all places and the things you've seen. Tell me what you've seen. It's crazy stuff you've seen.
John, it's actually easy to not talk about some of that because it's signed national or non-disclosure agreements, which threaten jail time if I do. But no, the Navy and the Navy intelligence community, shout out to my tribe there. But they did me right. They treated me well. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to serve in the greatest Navy on the planet and one of the greatest communities, the intelligence community.
Yeah, and apply that skill set to a wider world, commercial.
Well, John, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here at Babel Street. I wanted to stay close to the community and continue to support mission. So Babel Street has given me that opportunity to do that.
Yeah. When they talk about Babel Street, they talk about speed to insight. But I think with you, it's speed to trust. So my listener is going to get a high level of trust with you and maybe contact you down in the future.
Well, I'll tell you, trust is a huge part of what we do. It's part of our ethos because if you don't have trust, then why are we doing this, John?
Yep. Yeah, I might as well get a job. I don't know, John Gilroy's Donut Shop or something. That would be interesting seeing you apply for that.
Well, I'd still want to trust your donuts if I would have.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Jason English, CISSP, Vice President at Babel Street. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, John.